Okay, good morning again, Chairwoman Gallego and subcommittee members. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you today the City of Phoenix Employees Retirement System, otherwise known as COPERS. You had expressed interest in a few things: the board makeup, investment philosophy, and also some actuarial information. So that's what we'll be discussing with you today. With me today is Scott Miller, the Retirement Program Administrator. We're very fortunate to have Scott on our team. He has 20 years experience in the retirement areas, and very fortunate to have him as part of our team. Also with us today is Laura Wyrick, and Laura is part of the board's investment company called Makita, and Denise Olson, our Chief Financial Officer. So Scott will lead the presentation today.
Thank you. Of course, if you have any questions as we're going along, please remind me to turn on my microphone. And then if you have any questions as we're going forward, please let me know. I'll be happy to help you with those questions. So first, let's talk a little bit about COPERS itself. COPERS was created by Chapter 24, Article 2 of the City Charter back in 1953. So we've been around for quite some time. The board is also provided for by the City Charter. Within Section 4.1 of that Article 2 provides the responsibility and the authority of that board. As you can see, the authority and responsibility for the administration, management, and operation of the retirement plan and for construing and carrying into effect the provisions of this article are vested in the retirement board. So some quite broad authority for a retirement board, which is consistent with other retirement systems around the country. I've worked with between 35 and 40 other retirement boards, retirement systems around the country, and that's a very typical designation of trustee authority. This is a trust after all. The trustees themselves, there are 9 members of the COPERS board. 3 of those folks are elected city employees. The elections were just held in December. They were seated during the first meeting in January. The 3 city employees are Shailene Reynolds from Aviation. She is actually a holdover. She was on the board before, and so she was reelected to the board. She serves as the board's chair. Spencer Self with Neighborhood Services, who's in the audience today. He was a newly elected member, as was Mr. Jason Stokes with police, and you may know him with his work with Aspetia as well. So those are 3. Our 4th is a Phoenix citizen. So we have a citizen member that sits on the board, which is also fairly typical across the country. We have requirements for that Phoenix citizen, however. They have to be neither employed by the city nor receiving a benefit. So not an employee, not a retiree of the COPERS system, and who has at least 5 years experience in a private or public pension plan, which is quite a bit of experience. Right now, the member is John Heblum, who's the AZ Federal Credit Union General Counsel and HR Director. We are very, very lucky to have him. His term, unfortunately, expired at the end of December, and we've been trying to find a replacement. Since then, we're having a lot of trouble finding someone with that type of experience, with the 5 years in a private or public defined benefit plan. Mr. Heblum has graciously offered to stay on the board until we find that replacement. We're hoping to not find that replacement for another full term, but we'll see what we can do about that, because he is excellent. We also have a retired member. Susan Perkins, former Deputy Finance Officer, is retired, receiving a benefit from us. She is COPRA, the City Phoenix Retirees Association, comes together and decides who they would like to submit to the board. The board itself actually elects those 2 positions, the Phoenix citizen member and the retired member. We also have several ex officio board members. Ex officio, of course, being people who serve by virtue of their position within the city. One is the city manager or the city manager's designee, that is Ms. Toni Macaron. We also have the city treasurer, Kathleen Gitkin, who sits on the board, the city finance director, Denise Olson, sits on the board, and the city's, quote, urban manager or department head to be selected by the city manager. I don't know when Phoenix stopped having an urban manager, but it has been typically the HR director ever since that went away, and currently Lori Bays, our HR director, sits on the board as well. As I mentioned, COPERS is a trust, and so we have a trust fund. We have approximately $2.5 billion in that trust fund, give or take. It's been a little more give than take lately, but we are getting back some of the money we lost a couple weeks ago. This was, the city charter requires the board to follow what's called the prudent investor rule. This was added in 2013. by the voters of the city. It was taken to the voters. Before that, the board had what's called typically a legal list for its investments. And so there was a list of investments in which it could invest. Everything else the board was prohibited in investing from. Well, that was a fairly limited list. It prevented the board from doing some defensive things that would have really helped it in the 07, 08, 09 market crash. And so now we have what's called the prudent investor rule, which is by far the norm throughout the country for retirement boards and other trustees for that matter. And that says the retirement board shall invest and manage trust assets as a prudent investor would. It provides some other things, other guidelines for the board as far as what a prudent investor would take into account while it was making those decisions. In addition to the prudent investor rule, the board also must follow the kind of standard responsibilities and duties of a trustee. That includes the duty of prudence and the duty of loyalty. The duty of prudence requires the board to get educated. It has to learn about what it's doing. If it can't become an expert in the field, it has a responsibility to hire experts in the field. It hires an actuary to help with its actuarial work, and it hires an investment consultant, actually 2 investment consultants to help with the investment of the fund. One of those is a real estate investment consultant called Alinium, who helps the board with its, of course, real estate investments. And the other is the Makita Investment Group. And Laura Wyrick with the Makita Investment Group is here to talk about our investment program.
Good morning. Good morning, Councilwoman Gallego and Gallego and members of the subcommittee. I wanted to provide you a little bit of background on my firm first, so that you know who we are and what we do for COPERS. Makita Investment Group has been in business for 40 years. I'm based in our San Diego office. We have 6 offices, 5 in the United States and 1 in London. We're an independently owned investment advisory firm, which means we don't manage any assets. We recommend investment managers, but we do not receive any fees from anyone that we recommend. And we think that really aligns the interests of our clients with us. And we have 143 employees. We advise 160 or so individual clients, most of whom are pension funds, but we also do advise some endowments, foundations, and other types of tax-exempt institutional investors. And we work with over 200 individual funds. I thought I'd also mention which is somewhat unique in the financial services industry. We have a focus on diversity at our firm. 48% of our owners, including myself, are women or minorities, and 40% of our leadership team are also women or minorities. And we think that the research coming out on increasing amount of research on diversity of thought leading to better organizational decision-making is positive for us and our clients as well. So you can see on the slide that's popping up that we've worked for about 2.5 years with COPERS, and we've led a variety of educational discussions on a variety of topics, specifically investments. As you know, it's a relatively complicated field for folks that don't have an investment background. We think it's really important we think an educated investor is a more prudent investor, and it's really important that board members understand the decisions that they're making fully. And then we also have advised on governance, things like best practices, coming up with a statement of investment beliefs in terms of, do we have a preference for index funds that are lower cost or more costly actively managed strategies? What's the best way to come up with a policy statement and things to include in that investment policy statement as well? And then we've talked quite a bit about asset allocation. We found in working with our clients, there's sort of a happy medium between you have certain boards that perhaps might make the asset allocation decision maybe too quickly without enough education. How much of the assets are invested in, say, U.S. equity relative to bonds has major influence on the returns of the fund. So you don't want to be too quick with that decision. Then we also, on the opposite side of the spectrum, work with some boards that maybe take a bit too long, to speak so much about the educational process and learning about it that there aren't decisions made that can then have a positive impact going forward. And we really found that the COPERS board fell, we think, in that happy medium. It was about a 6-month period between when we first introduced potential asset allocation options and started that education process on new asset classes that then they adopted and started moving towards a new asset allocation. You can see that asset allocation on the next slide, the mix of assets. The only free lunch in investing is diversification. You want asset classes that zig and zag in different manners. I'll point out here what the abbreviation TIPS means. That's Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. Those are government guaranteed bonds that have their interest payments indexed to inflation. I'll point out that every investment consulting firm like Makita puts together our expectations for various asset classes for expected return, volatility or risk, and standard deviation. We model about 60 individual asset classes and come up with our long-term 20-year expected return for the asset allocation mix. So the adopted asset allocation for COPERS, we estimate, has a long-term expected return of about 7.3% with standard deviation of 12.1. That doesn't mean a whole lot when you're not looking at it relative to other potential asset allocations, but that is something that that COPERS put a lot of time into adopting. And I'll also mention, some of the changes with this asset allocation relative to past asset allocations. Hedge funds, for example, used to be a 15% weight in the prior asset allocation. Now it's 5%. One of the reasons for making that change was to save on investment management fees. Hedge funds are very expensive, and they invest in a lot of the asset classes like public equities and public fixed income that COPERS is able to access at a lower cost through things like index funds. In terms of implementation, once an asset allocation is adopted, then we go through each individual asset class and make sure that we think it's implemented in the correct way. Whenever there is a new asset class added, there's a competitive search process. So we bring into the board, as I mentioned, we don't have any relationships with investment management firms, so there's no incentive for us to recommend an expensive active manager over, say, a Vanguard index fund that any of us could access in a retirement plan. And the board considers various ways of implementing the different asset classes. Chairwoman, one of the things you had asked for us to take a look at was the PSPRS allocation relative to COPERS, and you can see that here. Makita Investment Group does not work with PSPRS, so we based this information on publicly available records. So some of the differences I just point out here, COPERS has a higher weight to emerging markets equity. We think that makes sense because, as you've probably heard a lot about, the developed world is really not growing at the same degree to which emerging markets are. Also, emerging markets equities looked relatively undervalued over the past several years relative to other say, U.S. equities that have a very high price to earnings multiple right now in general. I'll mention that rate-sensitive assets, so more conservative fixed income, is an area where COPERS has a more than 4 times weight, the PSPRS allocation. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see there that PSPRS has a much higher weight to risk parity, global tactical asset allocation, and then a small allocation to cash. So, global tactical asset allocation are generally active managers that can use any of the other asset classes across the spectrum. So a board would sort of be putting their faith in active managers that they are going to allocate correctly rather than making that decision themselves. So that's just sort of, I think, when I look at these two allocations, maybe a philosophical difference that I see.
All right, now we'll move on to your mid-morning nap with the actuarial evaluation discussion. The city charter also requires actuarial evaluations to be performed every year. That is a best practice. It's required by the city charter. Actuarial assumptions are used in order to come up with those actuarial evaluations. The actuarial assumptions themselves are created through actuarial experience studies, which are performed every 5 years. Again, that is also required by the charter and is also a best practice around the country. We last performed our experience study in 2015. We modified some of the mostly demographic assumptions at that point, and we did an update in 2017. The experience studies help analyze the plan's economic and demographic actual assumptions in comparison with general economic conditions and the plan's historical experience to come up with those economic and demographic assumptions that we use. The valuation mechanism itself actually, it comes up with the present value of the liabilities, and the way that it comes up with that is it takes all of those assumptions, so mortality assumptions, wage growth assumptions, longevity assumptions, when people are going to retire, inflation assumptions, and what it does is it actually projects a benefit stream for every member and every retiree. So the approximately 15,000 folks that we have as members and beneficiaries, our actuary creates a projected benefit stream for every one of those folks and then discounts that down to the present value using our assumed rate of return. We're actually required under the Governmental Accounting Standards Board and the Actuarial Standards of Practice to use our assumed rate of return to come up, to use as a discount rate to come up with the present value of those. When you get the present value of all of those together, that's what our actuarial liability is, and then we compare that to our assets to come up with whether we have or we come up with our funded ratio. And of course, right now we're at about a 57% funded ratio, so we have 57% of the assets required to satisfy that liability right now. But remember, that liability is projected out over the next 50 years for some people. I mean, when we have a 20-year-old person that comes on staff, their mortality, their life expectancy is probably somewhere in the 80s, and so we're projecting that out over almost 60 years. The demographic assumptions relate to kind of the individual. One of the most marked of those assumptions is, of course, our mortality assumption, how long a person's going to live. How long is Scott Miller, age 50, projected to live? That tells the actuary, okay, how long do I need to project those benefit streams for? And so that mortality assumption has one of the biggest effects as far as a demographic assumption. Those tables were updated in 2015. Our actuary came in and said, you know, you don't really have the experience. You're not big enough. We only have 15,000 members and retirees. We lose about 150 retirees every year. That sounds like a lot, and certainly to the individual it is, but as a broad brush, it's not nearly large enough experience to come up with an accurate statistical evaluation of what the plan as a whole's mortality is going to look like. And so what they did was they compared our actual mortality with a variety of available mortality tables out there. There's the MP 2014, and as you can see, there's the COPERS. COPERS is the California Public Employee Retirement System, the largest retirement system in the country right now. Compared it to them, their healthy annuitant mortality table, and that actually fit us the best as far as our healthy annuitants. We think part of the reason that probably fit us best is because what are all the employees for CalPERS? They are all public employees. Public employees have been shown to live longer for possibly two reasons. They have access to a defined benefit plan, which ensures that they have adequate resources throughout their life, and they have access to more and better health insurance. And so public employees just naturally live longer. The teachers of the world actually live the longest. We don't have any teachers on our system, and so that's why we use the CalPERS rather than the CalSTRS mortality table. They have about 1.9 million members and beneficiaries, retirees, and so they have a much more robust experience with which to construct their mortality tables and can come up with a statistically accurate mortality table, and that's why we use them. For the first time in 2015, the board also adopted a mortality improvement assumption. Every 5 years when we would do these experience studies, we would have these huge upticks in mortality. American mortality is improving every day. People are living longer. And so every 5 years we would have this huge uptick and we'd have increased contributions. You can see what just moving in 2015 did to our liability. It increased at 7.7%. It increased the contribution by 5%. So that was a big change. Our actuary came in and said, you know, one way that you can mitigate that going forward is by adopting future mortality improvement assumptions. And what that does is it assumes that we're going to keep getting older, that our mortality is going to keep improving. And so in 5 years, or actually in 2020, in 2 more years when we do another experience study, we're hopeful that that mortality improvement assumption that we used will actually result in a 0% increase in the mortality cost for the system, because we've already assumed beforehand that improvement. We've already built it into the cost structure of the plan. Again, as you can see, just the mortality change increased our liability by 7.7%. That was a chunk. Here are a few other examples of demographic assumptions. Disability rates, termination rates, and retirement rates are some of the biggest. I mentioned we have economic assumptions and demographic assumptions. So the economic assumptions, the assumed rate of return is, of course, one of the largest that we use. That was updated in 2017. We looked at it and had our actuary look at it in 2015 as well, but held off on changing it until 2017 for a couple of reasons. The board had just changed the assumed rate of return in 2013 when it had when the prudent investor rule was added in, as I mentioned before, and the breadth of our investable universe expanded, and we were able to take advantage of some defensive mechanisms in order to protect ourselves from market downturns. We dramatically changed our asset allocation. That changed the expected rate of return, and that's why they changed the assumed rate of return down from 8% down to 7.5% in 2013. So we just recently done it, but then also, if you recall from Ms. Wyrick's presentation, that was also the beginning of our look into a new asset allocation. And so the board didn't want to re-examine and make a change 2 years after it made a previous one, and then 2 years from making another change. And so it held off until the board adopted the new asset allocation in early 2017. Then we called up our actuarial consultant and said, please take a look at our economic assumptions again. And they recommended that we move down to a 7.25% assumed rate of return. In order to come up with that number, what they did was they took Makita's, what are called capital market assumptions, or their assumptions for what our asset classes are going to return over the next 20 years, used 9 other investment consultants' capital market assumptions, along with their own economic modeling and projections to come up with a reasonable range of assumed rates of return. 7.5 was within at least a reasonable range, but not a very probable range. The 7.25% was a much better fit for our asset allocation, and so the board moved that to 7.5% in about August or September of last year, and we used it for the first time in the June 30, 2017 actuarial valuation. A couple other economic assumptions that we actually changed last year was our PEP assumption. The PEP is kind of akin to a COLA. It's a post-employment increase in retiree benefits. We had assumed an annual 1.5% increase. We've never been able to achieve that, unfortunately. As a matter of fact, this year it's going to be a 0.34% increase. And so we moved that down to 1.25%. We also moved the wage increase assumption from 3.5 down to 3%. The wages aren't going up as quickly as had been projected 5 years ago. And because of those two changes, that actually only increased the contribution rate by about 0.22%. You would have expected a much larger contribution increase with a 1/4 point reduction in that assumed rate of return, because as your assumed rate of return goes down, you're discounting by a smaller percentage, and so your liability goes up. So you would have expected a much higher contribution increase, but it was only 0.22. The liability, or contribution increase, the liability increase was actually only 0.05%, so incremental change in that liability. And that's really what we have for you today. Of course, I would be more than happy to address any questions that you have. I hope you found this informative. We certainly enjoy it and appreciate your attention.
Wonderful.